Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula with Adam and Rob. Today we're going to get you and your fantasy teams ready for the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. Rob, you're looking tan and happy after your trip to Miami. How was it?
Thanks, Adam. I got a bit sunburnt, so obviously that's probably what you're seeing on screen for those of you watching video format. But yeah, it was a great weekend. Another good sprint weekend in the books and a new race winner in Lando Norris. So I think a shot in the arm that Formula One certainly needed, and really looking forward to seeing how he can continue to build on that good form heading into Imola.
We've had 3 constructors win one of the first 6 races for the first time since 2018. So, Rob, you're welcome to go back to Miami if that's going to be the result anytime. All right, let's get into the Fantasy Formula Live League. And this time, the top 3 teams all used the 3x DRS boost in Miami. And to do that, they had to sacrifice their second constructor for a better 2x driver. So I'll be interested to see if this works out for them in the next few weeks. Meanwhile, the next tier of drivers down were the top teams the previous week, and they're just a few points back. So I think the league's going to really shake up in the next few races.
Definitely. I think, we've talked about the 3x DRS boost and some of the better times to use it this season. So I'm curious to see whether or not these guys at the top of the leaderboard can hold on over the course of the season, or if, as you say, if people a bit further back are able to make up some ground when they decide to use it later on.
And it's not too late to join. Feel free to join the 100,000 plus strategists in the Fantasy Formula League. We'd love to have you. All right, moving down to our 5th Gear Garms giveaway this week. Very important question after Lando's maiden win last time out. Does Lando earn his 3rd straight Imola podium? So this would not only be Lando's 3rd straight podium of 2024, but also his 3rd straight Emilia Romagna Grand Prix podium, because he took home P3 in both 2021 and 2022. So I'm going to go with yes, Lando makes it 3 in a row. What about you, Rob?
I'm right there with you, Adam. I think he's got a lot of momentum coming out of Miami. We've got that McLaren upgrade package that we know about, and I fully expect with that good track record at Imola that he looks like a very good shot to continue to build on that. I am curious to see whether or not Ferrari's upgrades are enough to propel them back into the front of the field with Red Bull, and if so, then maybe Lando misses out on his 3rd straight year in the podium at Imola. But right now, all signs are pointing to another visit for him onto one of the top steps.
And we want to hear from you. Do you think Lando's going to get his 3rd straight Imola podium? So head on over to the Fantasy Formula base on the FanAmp app. Let us know what you think and be entered for a chance to win this great prize. Moving on now to our winners and losers from Miami, starting, of course, with Lando Norris. So, took 110 race starts, but Lando finally picked up his maiden F1 win. And like Rob mentioned a moment ago, the upgrades were huge for Lando. This was a race that he finished P17 at last season, so a huge turnaround from Lando year over year. And even though his 25 fantasy points were only P5, he survived a DNF in the Saturday sprint, so a really huge comeback on Sunday for Lando.
Yeah, huge turnaround for him after, as you said, a pretty disappointing start on the Saturday. But you just wonder whether or not he could have scored even more, and you'd have to think so had he not DNF'd in the sprint. So, you can say a winner for Lando Norris with 25 fantasy points, but it could have been close to double that if he just was able to emerge unscathed from that chaos. So kudos to Lando. Condolences to the people that 2x'd him, because it could have been a lot more. And I fully expect him to continue that momentum into Imola.
Back-to-back driver of the day wins for Lando too, and this is the category they led all drivers in 2023. So if he's off to a great start in that category this year, we could really be relying on him later in the year. Rob, who was your first winner?
Look, we've got a couple of interesting picks in the winners department this week, and I've got Max Verstappen. Now, I think on face value, you look at Max Verstappen, you expect, anything less than a win is a loss for him, but you can't look past 40 points. He was the highest scoring driver for the 3rd week in a row, and I think he's now 4 out of the last 6 weekends. He's been the highest scoring driver in F1 fantasy. He's got an impeccable record at Miami. He'd won the last 2 races, had the fastest lap in the last 2 races, and the driver of the day in both. Now, I would have been remiss to completely ignore any of that, but at the same time, I don't think the likelihood of him reaching such lofty heights was as likely this time around. But notwithstanding that, a pretty good result. Taking out the sprint, finishing 2nd in the Grand Prix. Look, just another solid weekend in the books for Max.
To put in perspective how rare this is the first North American Grand Prix that Max hasn't won since Valtteri won at COTA in 2019. So his dominance around these circuits has been pretty amazing these last few years. So kudos to Lando for knocking it off.
Yeah.
My second winner this week was Yuki Tsunoda, and Daniel Ricciardo really stole our attention with his P4 finish in the Saturday sprint, but 23 points for Yuki in the fantasy game thanks to his P7 on Sunday, and it's the most fantasy points for Yuki since COTA last year, and he was the 6th highest scoring driver in fantasy this week, and the only driver to get a $1 million price boost in the game, so those of you that ran Yuki were definitely rewarded.
Yeah, huge result for him. He's been kind of out of the blocks the last few races, and I fully expect he's going to continue that. RB looked to have finally got a hold of this car and these upgrades. So, I think there's a lot of value to unlock in Yuki. I'm maybe not so sure about his teammate yet, but the signs were there in the sprint race for Ricciardo. But certainly Yuki, as you pointed out, 1 million banked, the highest rising driver over the Miami weekend. I'm very much expecting a similar theme to continue into the races to come. In terms of my second winner of the weekend, I had Pierre Gasly, and it's become a bit of a theme the last few episodes, Adam, where I probably give you a bit of stick for Alpine, but they've really delivered on the improved development to the floor since China, and there's also those initiatives around reducing the weight of the car. Gasly himself has outscored Ocon over the 2 races fantasy-wise. He's had 28 points and is second among all drivers priced under 19 million for total points across China and Miami. So Zhou, the only one to have outscored him over that same period of time. Pretty good record. I think he's really capitalizing on the fact that he hasn't really had many great qualifying performances. His best result before Miami was a P15. So really what you're getting, or what you want to be getting from a driver at that price. And he's also had a boon of overtakes too. So Pierre Gasly, I think, certainly one to watch heading into this weekend. And at his price, I think it's 8.3 million. A good alternative to some of the other drivers in the midfield. What do you make of Gasly?
I totally agree, and I'm really glad to see this take of mine from the preseason finally start to gain some traction. You had mentioned some of those good results from Alpine. They had that floor repair 2 Grand Prix ago. They finished P11 and P13 in China, P10 and P12 in Miami after only cracking the top 15 twice in their first 4 races. So really big improvement from Alpine, and I think you're going to see them early and often throughout the show as drivers that we suggest are on the rise as we look for some of those gainers in the midfield.
Great. From someone who's gone from zero to hero, give me a driver or in your case, a chip that might have gone from hero to zero in back-to-back weeks.
In fairness to the people that played it in China, I wasn't sure if Limitless was a good idea then. It turned out to be a huge play, and those of us that played Limitless in Miami, by comparison, were losers. It was 98 fewer points for us in Miami than those that ran it in China. That Lando DNF certainly damaged the team, and overtakes were a big difference between the 2 races. There were 14 overtakes from the top 5 drivers in Miami versus 33 in China. Never mind all the positions gained in between there too. So big differences between the 2 weeks. But for me, Rob, I still compare it to last year at COTA when we used this chip, had those DQs to Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. So it's still a success for me, but a far cry from the 456 points that others got.
Yeah, definitely. Look, I think it's fair to say it wasn't as successful as China. The points speak for themselves, as you said, but I think it would probably be a little bit of an overstep for me to say it was a complete and utter failure. The Norris DNF in the sprint, obviously not what we hoped for, but it still was the top 5 scoring drivers most Limitless teams went for. So in that sense, I could say it was a success. But as you say, over the 2 weekends, we're probably down anywhere, but depending on the lineups you've run across those 2 Grand Prix, down anywhere between 50 and 100 points. So not ideal, but again, it's a long season, plenty of races to recover the gap, and I fully expect that we'll hopefully be able to claw some of that back in these next few weeks.
Agreed. So your first loser, Rob, is a tough luck loser. Tell us about Logan Sargent.
Yeah, poor old Logan Sargent. He was looking really good through the sprint race. He'd banked 10 points, and I was like, Logan Sargent, another $0.5 million increase. Thank you very much. And then lo and behold, DNF'd. Although I wouldn't say it was entirely his fault, getting nabbed by Kevin Magnussen from behind in a little bit of careless driving, I think, from the Dane. So not ideal, and he did go down in price, even though I wasn't running him, given I was on Limitless. But his first DNF of the season, we did talk about the fact in last week's show that his luck was bound to run out, and run out it did. So It's a shame for Logan, and a lot of people are probably looking to ship him out this weekend if they can make room for it.
Yeah, breaks that streak of 9 consecutive Grand Prix without a DNF, and the -7 points that he got for those that had him was his lowest fantasy score in 11 races. So really a tough luck loss for Logan. And we're going to talk about later on, this was a really tough week for Logan on a few fronts because there's some news looming over him. So stay tuned for more on that. My second loser this week was Lance Stroll. He was caught up in that collision that took Lando out of the sprint. He finished with -19 points, which was last on the grid, and he's tied with Daniel Ricciardo for the most DNFs on the season with 2. Some teams ran Norris as their 2X driver and Stroll as a budget enabler, and they had -60 points coming out of turn 1 of the sprint. So it could have been a lot worse for us. I know some of you got a piece of that, and luckily Norris redeemed you on Sunday. But Lance was also not helped by the 6 positions loss in the Grand Prix. So just a tough weekend overall for him. And it really underpins that Stroll has a lot of upside, but you can occasionally have some real clunkers.
Yeah, a bit of a stinker for the Canadian there. Definitely was not what owners would have liked or hoped for. And he was really building towards something over the last 3 races, although it looks as though he may have fallen off a little bit, particularly with the fact that Sonoda as a great alternative seems to have replaced him in that kind of price bracket in the C tier asset class. So a stinker for him, -19 over the weekend, as you said, 2 DNFs. A little bit of I like to think of him a little bit of a Logan Sargent type, maybe a slightly more reliable Logan Sargent, but obviously someone that has a little bit of upside. When it pays off, great. When it doesn't, you can really be left holding the bag. So not a great weekend for Stroll and his owners across the board.
And that dovetails really nicely into your second loser. It's anybody who ran the constructor.
Yeah, I mean, we've probably kind of harped on about that with Stroll, and by extension of that, the constructor suffered as well, -7 points for them, and it was the lowest score from any constructor over the weekend. They just haven't really got to the heights I was probably expecting from them. I wasn't certainly going to see wins all of a sudden from Alonso, but by the same token, they've had high of 35 points in Australia this year, and given that we've seen scores of 29 and -7 on sprint weekends where you typically score more points, just not what you'd expect from the constructor. So not a great weekend for Lance Stroll and Aston Martin owners alike.
And just to cover off something that you and I talked about over the weekend on social media, Rob, is that Aston Martin has fallen into tier C for their budget, which means they could theoretically gain up to 1.5 million in value if they have a highly above average week at Imola this weekend. But I just don't trust it. This would be the most we've seen from any asset in terms of value gain this year, but you'd be leaving over 50 points per race on the table when you compare them with Ferrari. And as we saw in Miami, it's not a given that you're going to get an above average week out of them.
No, not at all. You really need Fernando Alonso to podium. You need Lance Stroll to have a decent result, neither of which I can see happening. And I wouldn't trust the constructor as far as I can throw them right now. So I think it's probably a wait and see. If you're really desperate for cash, go for the Aston Martin constructor. But as you say, you're leaving a lot of points on the table. And I think you've got to be kind of just accepting of your fate if you're down 50 or 75 points just from going for Aston Martin over Red Bull. So I'd probably avoid unless you're, as you say, really trying to make a differential play.
Agreed. Let's move on now to our hit list, and item number 1 for this week is the upgrade arms race. So we saw in Miami what Lando can do with the upgraded MCL 38. Now his teammate Piastri is going to get the last 50% of that package. Meanwhile, Ferrari debuted a very new SF24 at Fiorano last week, and that was the test that made headlines because they were trying out those big tire covers to avoid the spray in wet conditions. But you could see some very visible changes on the Ferrari in that running. And then we heard also from Helmut Marko that Max Verstappen could be getting upgrades this weekend too. So it's going to be a lot of changes for us to assess in the early sessions this week.
Yeah, I think Ferrari particularly catch my eye with the upgrades they're rolling out at Imola, their first big package of the season. And I think we're going to see hopefully some improved performance. Although in Miami, they had some of the best race pace among all drivers, all teams. So I don't think they're necessarily at a disadvantage trying to claw their way back to the front with these upgrades. I wouldn't say the visual upgrades with the HP sponsorship is one such upgrade, but hopefully in terms of car setup, we see a few strides forward made from the Scuderia. And I think Leclerc, Sainz, they've been building towards something. Sainz with that win in Australia. Leclerc's looked really good the last couple of sprint race weekends. I think Ferrari are starting to cook something up.
A lot of people have been asking us about which 2x driver you run if you're not going to run Verstappen, and I think it really is going to come down to the free practices. We didn't have the benefit of race simulations from the sprint weekend. F1.com didn't publish them. So I think after we see those practice sessions and see the performance of those upgrades on this track, I think we can have a good sense of who we can settle in with this week.
Definitely. Lots of selection dilemmas coming up this weekend. So I'm really curious, as you say, to unpack that free practice data when it's available.
And I have a lot of optimism for Lando Norris, especially because of the data that you can see here from Formula Data Analysis. And there was a really great finding here that a lot of people might think that Lando won this race because Verstappen picked up damage from hitting the bollard. But if you look at these laps just before Max went off track, Lando was lapping faster than Max. So even though he was consistently faster after the incident, Lando was gaining on Max leading up to it too. So if those upgrades can continue to evolve the McLaren forward, I think they could be fighting for race wins as early as this week. So I'm really keeping my fingers crossed for that.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated to see whether or not with the second half of the upgrades Piastri gets as well, if that suddenly makes the McLaren constructor worth considering. I think Norris, as you've pointed out, becomes a very good and decent candidate for the 2x DRS boost. But you know, if Piastri as well and those upgrades deliver, he was already kind of at the front of the pack in Miami in the Grand Prix. If that can continue into Imola, I think we've got a lot of tricky decisions on our hand in those kind of premium driver slots.
And this week we have two FanAmp Pick of the Week questions. The first one is in qualifying, what will be the gap between the fastest McLaren and the fastest Ferrari? For me, I think it's going to be a close one with all these upgrades. I'm going to say McLaren by less than a tenth. What about you, Rob?
I'm going to play devil's advocate and go Ferrari less than a tenth. I think the upgrades hopefully are probably just going to push them slightly ahead. But again, McLaren have got upgrades of their own that they've either unleashed in Miami or are going to continue to in Imola. So as you say, I think it'll be close, but I'm leaning Ferrari. As a Ferrari fan, my bias has probably crept in a little bit here.
And for anybody who hasn't played the FanAmp picks yet, every 6 races they reset the new sector. So this is the start of Sector 2, and you have a chance to win great prizes. So if you haven't started playing yet, you can jump in now and then have a chance to win the Sector 2 prize. Let's move on to the history at Imola, and it's been just full of rain. So this race was called off last year due to some of the extreme flooding in the area, but previous years were a washout too. Like in 2022, the race started under rain. You had Sainz and Ricciardo come together on the first lap. Meanwhile, Leclerc was in the podium positions and then spun himself out later on, so that dropped him off the podium. Then in 2021, we had Leclerc, Hamilton, Perez, Schumacher all find themselves off the track due to the wet conditions. Meanwhile, another 4 drivers DNF'd. So this race seems to be really reliant on the weather. You can see here one of the forecasts that has some rain for Sunday, but there have been a lot of conflicting forecasts. A lot of the European models have it being dry this weekend, so going to be a very interesting subject as we head into the weekend.
Yeah, I think every forecast I read is a different one at the moment. So kind of take what you're seeing a few days out from the race weekend with a grain of salt in terms of forecasts. I think there probably will be some degree of precipitation over the 3-day period, but I can hardly see it influencing the race too much unless we see something way out of the ordinary. So maybe just keep it in mind, but I wouldn't say it's likely to influence our decisions greatly unless, of course, we see a drastic change in the forecast between now and when free practice kicks off on Friday.
One other historical note here, we talked earlier about Lando's 3 straight podiums here. Only Norris and Leclerc have top 10 finishes in the last 3 races at Imola. There's always been some degree of incident or someone dropping out of the top 10 places, so you could expect some chaos if the rain does fall.
Wow, okay. I'm looking forward to the chaos then.
Next, I want to break into 2 fantasy headlines that have emerged over the last week and a half or so. The first is about K-Mag. He's sitting on 10 penalty points for his super license. He picked up half of those in Miami alone. Rob had mentioned some of his reckless driving earlier to take out Logan Sargent. And they don't come off his super license for a full year because all 10 points have come on in these first 6 races. So we might see a 1-race ban in his future soon. Ollie Behrman is running free practice 1 for Haas this weekend, and I suspect if he does sit out a race, we'll see Ollie in that seat. Rob, what do you think about the likelihood of Magnussen sitting out a race soon, and what that could mean for Behrman as he comes back in, potentially at a different price than when he left us with Ferrari?
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting one that the sport hasn't really been faced with in recent times in terms of a driver suspension. So I'd be curious to see what happens when he hits the threshold. Behrman, as you say, he's waiting in the wings. He would certainly come in at a much lower price as a Haas driver compared to the 15 or 14 million he was as a Ferrari driver. So I certainly think should that eventuality occur, then Behrman you'd think would slot in if he's running free practice as well for Haas this weekend. But I'm not so sure if that's happened. I'm not so sure if it actually will happen. It certainly could, but we'll just have to wait and see. And I think I think there's no need to suddenly knee jerk a transfer in advance of something we don't know yet. But at the same time, as you've said, Adam, and as I pointed out before, the kind of carelessness and reckless driving that Magnussen's demonstrated the last week or two makes me think he's probably on the way out of the template. He's done his work. He's got us a lot of price increases for when we have owned him. Maybe his time's up and someone like Pierre Gasly is waiting in the wings to come on right in.
I want to jump down to the second FanAmp pick of the week question because it's right in line with this topic. Does Kevin Magnussen pick up a penalty point in the race this week? I think not this week. He's going to keep it clean, but it's inevitable. I'll say even by the summer break, he gets those last 2 penalty points and we see a replacement in Ollie Behrman.
Yeah, I'm aligned on that. I'm not so sure he's going to rack up any more penalty points anytime soon. He's probably got a slap on the wrist from Ayo Komatsu and the team at Haas, but I think right now he'll probably be driving a little safer just to make sure he's not at risk of losing a seat for a race.
The other driver news from this past week and a half or so is Logan Sargeant. There's these rumors that he'll be replaced by Kimi Antonelli because a team, which we assume is Williams, has requested that the FIA grant the 17-year-old his super license. Now, James Vowles said that Sargeant is definitely in for this weekend, and I'd be shocked if a 17-year-old makes his debut in Monaco, but that early June timeline for the Canadian Grand Prix, we could see a driver swap. So I recommend either getting Sargeant out of your teams now, or if you really need him for that budget to enable the max build, have a third transfer at the ready for the next couple of races in case you need to move someone around.
Yeah, I fully agree that carrying a third transfer into the weekends ahead is probably prudent. Again, kind of like Kevin Magnussen and the penalty points, I wouldn't start incurring trades to premeditate something that we're not entirely sure about. And given we don't have to make these decisions until the transfer or the qualifying deadline, then perhaps just stand pat. But I definitely think your advice there, Adam, is the smart way of doing things. Just roll of transfers. We don't have any sprint races coming up. It's not a chip heavy weekend anytime soon. So I think maybe just roll transfers as we need them and then react to the news accordingly once it's announced, if it's announced, should there be a need to move Sargeant out.
And a reminder that's worth saying again here is that it's important to hold your line of decision until the end of the week. I found that when Sainz was out earlier this season, a lot of people had to go back, take a penalty because they had made their substitutions Monday, Tuesday. The Sainz appendectomy was later in the week. So make sure you're using your transfers right up to the deadline as close as you can. I'd say no earlier than Thursday or Friday when a lot of this news breaks. Yep. All right, heading over to topic number 4, we call it Midfield Madness because this is the time where we're looking for budget enablers and drivers that are going to grow in price. Several of our top options heading into the season are starting to struggle. We just talked about Magnussen a moment ago. Meanwhile, Alex Albon is the most selected driver in the game, but he's averaging just 1.7 points per race. So we need these midfield drivers to get overtakes if they're going to really show their worth in this game. But he's only 14th in the category of overtakes. So I worry about Albon and Magnussen. Rob, who are some midfield candidates that you recommend this time of year?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. K-Mag and Albon, for the reasons you've mentioned, probably seem to have fallen out of favor a little bit. And, we talked about Alpine earlier. Gasly in particular at his affordable price, is one such option I think that really stands out. He's looked great since Alpine have made some tweaks to the car setup. Ocon's another driver that's also, looked the goods. I wouldn't say he's quite on the same level as Pierre fantasy-wise, even though he has got the edge on Gasly in qualifying at the very least and scored that solitary point for Alpine as well. But I think Gasly, a similar price point to the K-Mags, the Albons, etc., Gasly makes for a very ready-made replacement. His overtakes are up, his positions gained are up, his total points are up. So you have to think that if that trend continues, his price is also going to go up, and that's what you really want from those kind of budget enablers under 10 million.
I agree. I love the Alpine take this week. And I'd also throw Yuki Tsunoda's name into the ring here. I think he's had a string of really good races. He had some bad luck earlier in the season, but he's proven to be a reliable budget driver as well.
Definitely.
And speaking of budget drivers, I want to talk about the new segment we have on the show here. So now that our budgets have spread out, we don't all have the same lineup. So if Rob and I share our teams, it might not make sense for all of you. So this week, we're starting to roll out 3 different lineups based on the different budgets that some of you may have. So in team number 1, I recommend Perez as the 2X driver just to start the week. But as we said earlier, with these upgrades, let's see what happens with the race simulations. You could see Lando, Leclerc, Sainz, or maybe even someone else in this spot. And if you have the extra 0.3 million here, I'd take Gasly over Albon in this space, but I wanted to keep it within that budget. Rob, what do you think of team 1?
Yeah, I really like it. It's got, in terms of consistency and reliability, the kind of drivers that we've already talked about. Hulkenberg, he's looked very good and very consistent. Tsunoda on an upward trajectory. Bottas, the cheapest asset, only second to Sargent, I mean to say, in the game, if my math is correct. And I really like the fact that Sauber have taken a step forward with their pit stop, so it's one less worry for Sauber owners to think about heading into the race weekends. And then Albon, I know, obviously we just mentioned him as probably one to move on. If you've got enough money to get to someone like Gasly, then I'd certainly think about doing that. But Albon's not a scrub. I don't think he's by any means the best value asset in the game. But they do have a car at the moment compared to last season that's suited 2 more tracks, and they've probably taken a couple of steps back to take a few steps forward this season. So even though he was a little pessimistic after Miami, I still think he is himself a reliable driver. He's experienced. He's going to, when he does finish the race, just get you a couple of overtakes. You know, he'll probably go out in Q1 too, more often than not, based on the pace of that Williams. So a lot of factors in his favor. And at 106 million, there's people like Logan Sargent that you're better off avoiding. So Albon's, not a bad option.
Moving on now to team 2. This is the max meta with a little bit of heartburn. So you've got Sargent and double Sauber. And I think even the worst max build has higher upside than teams like the tier 1 team that can't quite afford max yet. Just max and the constructors alone will get you a ton of points. And if your backmarkers survive the race, you get some cost cap growth too. So I always recommend max in these 2 constructors if you can afford it.
Yeah. I mean, I think you and I have got a pretty similar team heading into Imola. I do think max as a 2X is the standout candidate. The compromise in some cases, as is the team 2 here, is some of you have to deal with Logan Sargent, myself included. I think the one thing I will say for non-sprint weekends is, I think I mentioned before, you could maybe make the case for non-max lineups, even with a $110 million budget. So I'm really eager to see what those points projections look like on f1fantasytools.com. But in terms of Max Red Bull Ferrari lineups at 110 million, it's pretty good. I think if you've got a little bit more budget, you could probably squeeze in a Pierre Gasly if you liked him over Hulkenberg. But all things look pretty good, I think.
And then moving on to team number 3 now, it's basically max with more secure midfield drivers. And if you were just 0.1 million above this, you could run Hulkenberg over Albon if you like him better. I particularly like that lineup if you have 114.1 million, but basically just a safer version of tier 2.
Yeah. It's an upgrade from Sargent to Albon. It's an upgrade from Zhou to Tsunoda. And then Gasly and Hulkenberg, again, similarly priced, so you could interchange either of those 2.
Let us know what you think about this. Is your budget much higher than this, much lower? Do we miss something in the middle? Let us know in the comments section if you're watching us on YouTube, or if you're listening to us as a podcast. Feel free to hit us up on any of our socials or in our FanAmp base and let us know, did this hit the mark for you? Rob, we're back to live shows 1 hour before qualifying this weekend. I'm excited to be back at our usual spot and time. We're all in the saddle in our home bases. So I think it's going to be a really good live show this weekend.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. As you say, 1 hour before the qualifying kicks off, a lot of decisions to make now that a couple of chips are out of the way for each of us. So really fascinated to see what we can unpack with your lineup selection dilemmas in the live stream. Be sure to go over to our FanAmp base to submit your teams over there. And really excited, Adam, to chop it up the hour before. The stress is always higher. The stakes are always higher. it'll be good to get back online and punch out 60 minutes of fantasy discussion.
It'll be 9 a.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. BST. We hope to see you there. Until then, thanks for watching.